available in the lobby after the show. I kept finding out stories about Maureen Boozer. I mean, in the end, I discovered found out more about her than some journals. That's not here we go. So, anyway, well, over the years I've continued progressing on carbon destruction. Research began in 1994. I finished it in 15 years later. Not a joke. I found more and more and kept it a little bit aside. Well, after Chronicle came out, I had a number of people tell me you should write a book about Maureen. So I went down the rabbit and I had basically new information I had found out about her over the years. I went ahead and just added to my original article. And finally I said, and so I looked at what I had and said, I got enough to write a book. So I wrote the first fact-based biography of Maureen, and that came out about less than 10 years ago. And it took me 6 months to do it. The quickest book I ever wrote. But she is one of those stories. Part of the problem doing it, well, two big problems. First of all, anytime you do any research about South Carolina in the 1860s, especially Columbia, you're going to have a lot of gaps because so much was destroyed during the Civil War, especially when a guy from Ohio came and did an urban renewal program. And the other thing is with Maureen, you find so many legends and stories about her. It's like trying to separate the wheat from the chaff. It's like a myth buster. You know, what can I say is true? What can I say is probable? What can I say is bogus? So, I will admit at first hand there are a few gaps in the story that you can drive a Greyhound bus through, but this is about as close as we can get to the truth. Okay, as I say, I like to call this 50 Shades of Blue and Gray, which if I had to redo the title, that is what I would call it. Okay. The last film that Orson Welles directed was called F is for Feather. And in the film he says, for the next hour we're going to tell you nothing but the truth. Afterwards, we're going to lie to you. And so this is sort of like that. The first part is the truth, the second part is the story. Okay, Marie's mother was Amelia C. She was born in Philadelphia January 30, 1819. This kind of shows you how things have changed a bit. The picture on the left is something I had taken from the old Columbia record. And this is one I found online a few years later. She married her first husband at 15, Henry or Thomas Harnett. She was also the seventh of 9 children. And she was of French Huguenot descent. Henry or Thomas died the day after the wedding. In 1841, she married Peter Burton of Columbia, and she moved to South Carolina. And Burton went to Philadelphia on a buying trip. He worked for a merchant dealer. And 5 or 6 years later, Mary Adele Peter Burton was born. He died in 1847, allegedly murdered. We don't know. Well, Maureen decided to take a vacation in Newberry because, after all, there's no more romantic, exciting, thrilling location for a vacation in South Carolina than Newberry.
My wife there.
Actually, I'll tell you what's funny is one time I got a book about this play, and the author of this little book, it was kind of like a Cliff Notes book. And he was a professor of English at the University of Puerto Rico. And I was saying, yeah, if I want to study English, I'm going to go to Puerto Rico. Anyway, myth number 3. Big Dave Boozer was a wealthy planner with a known for energy and high spirits. He also owned a hotel. By the way, the name Boozer is very common in Newberry County. I mean, you can pretty much throw a rock at
one here.
Yeah, I mean, you can. It's like I tell about Lexington County. You can't throw a rock in Lexington County without hitting a Shealy. The same is true for the Boozers in Newberry. There was another Dave Boozer who was a doctor, since people sometimes get the two confused. They married in 1845. Boozer adopted Mary renaming her Mary Sarah Amelia Booster as her first and second wife. Things went bad for Booster both financially and personality-wise, which everyone blamed on Amelia. And on February 10, 1850, Big Dave blew the left side of his head off with a double-barrel shotgun. Keep in mind, she is now widowed 3 times, and she's not even 35 yet. They were formally charged. Amelia was suspected of killing her husband and attempting to poison her mother-in-law. Dave left very detailed explicit instructions as well on how he wanted his grave done, setting aside $1,500 for it, which even today, that's actually about average price for a funeral today. Just imagine how much that was in those days. Amelia challenged it in court and got a partial victory. And for all that trouble, that's the site today. It was later moved to the big cemetery in Newberry by the college.
Rosemont.
Yeah, a little hard to find spot. I tried to look for it one day, I couldn't. Amelia was also accused of having an affair with Dr. Eugene Tolman in Columbia. And he was so disgusted, he moved to California, which was actually California's game because he became a pioneering physician and is considered one of the most important physicians in California in the 19th century. So, Amelia, you ever heard the expression, she came in a taxi and left in a limo? Mm-hmm. That was Amelia. Shortly after Big Dave's death, she went to Columbia and came back with a carriage and a whole bunch of clothes and stuff. In other words, she went on a big buying spree. Well, the members of the Abilene Presbyterian expelled her from the congregation for dressing unbecoming a widow. Obviously, they didn't like her being black, or not, she didn't wear black, and alleged affair and conduct in general, and she was literally forced out of Newberry.
Forced out of Newberry?
Huh?
Out of Newberry or
Yeah,
Columbia?
out of Newberry. She was chased out of Newberry. Columbia don't care. Eventually, she moved to Columbia and married husband number 4, Jacob Jefferson Norris Feaster, in 1852. The Feaster family is from Winsboro. There's a Feasterville in Winsboro in Fairfield County, and apparently there are still a bunch of Feasters who live there today. Their house was right here in the corner of Sumter and Washington Street, and where the Tom building is where Burton had a store. Very successful businessman. They had 3 children together. This is the only picture I could find of any of them. Julia C. Feaster, which was taken around 1854. In Columbia, Mary became a public spectacle. She drove around town in a glass-covered carriage that was called the Beauty Box. Mary Chestnut made note of it in her diary and says, everywhere you go, there's, boozers on parade. She also known to flirt with the students at South Carolina College. One student later wrote that she was always there at the gates of the Horseshoe, right when classes let out. As far as her intelligence, I've read 2 different things. One says that she was fluent in French. Others said that it was all packaging and no substance with her. But she was formally educated. Brigadier General John Preston called Marie the most beautiful piece of flesh and blood he had ever beheld. Direct quote. I love his mutton chops. My wife won't let me have them. And she was allegedly engaged to the General's son William, who died during the battle at Atlanta in 1864, summer of 1864. There is a picture of the Columbia Record reprinted back in the 1950s. Well, unfortunately, it's so bad, they copied on microfilm, I couldn't use it, but supposedly of her taking in the gardens of the Hampton Preston House. And if you haven't seen the gardens lately, you need to check them out. They've done a really nice job of restoring it. Marie's only known contribution to the war was a volunteer nurse at Columbia's Wayside Hospital. If you ever seen the scene in Gone with the Wind where Scarlett goes down to the train depot, you get thousands of soldiers, that was that here, except on a much smaller scale. They would get basic triage and they'd be sent to what is now South Carolina College, or the Horseshoe, which was turned into a hospital at the time, for further care.
A lot of those were outdoors, not indoors.
The ones here were outdoors. Then once it got to all the buildings that were used for dormitories were converted into hospital rooms. What was the old President's House, which is where McKissick Museum is at the top, that was used for officers, and they would also bury the soldiers who died there behind the house. Those bodies were later removed to Elmwood Cemetery. In the fall of 1864, the Confederate Army opened Camp Sorghum, a POW camp that housed 1,300 and 1,400 captured federal officers in modern-day West Columbia. If you know the area where those big radio towers are off of 378, right as you climb up the hill, that's roughly the area where we believe Sorghum was. Sorghum was not a particularly secure camp. About a third of the prisoners escaped. The people picked the site because they thought that the rivers would deter escapes. Actually, they helped them. Soldiers quickly figured out, hey, we can follow this little river up into North Carolina where they're beating us, so it'll take us into Tennessee. And that's what happened. One of the prisoners, by the way, was Samuel Byers. He was who later the U.S. ambassador to Switzerland. He was the author of 31 books, several of which dealt with his entitlement at Camp Sorghum. He also wrote the poem Sherman's March to the Sea, and he also wrote the official Iowa State song, whose title is the official Iowa State song, set to the tune of "Oh Christmas Tree." Not exactly an original songwriter, but his books about sorghum, what he wrote about sorghum is fascinating, and much of what we know about it comes from him.
So he escaped through the river?
He did, but a lot of them did. They would just
A
follow
lot
the
of
river.
them did the river, but he didn't.
No, he was in Columbia. I'll show you what happened. Amelia, by the way, was a frequent visitor to the camp. Apparently, some say so was Marie. And there's actually a letter in the official records of the War of Rebellion where Confederate officials is giving permission for a Union officer who's imprisoned at Sorghum to go visit Amelia.
These were Southern Confederates that were in the prison.
No, they were federal officers.
Federal officers.
Yeah. Both sides during the war separated officers and enlisted men POW camps because they were under the belief that separating them would make it less likely that someone would escape. And as Sorghum proved them, not so fast. Okay, in December 1864, the prisoners were moved to Camp Asylum, or also known as Camp Lunacy, on the grounds of the State Hospital. That's the Babcock building there, where they that's a model of the site. We did some archaeology there several years ago.
That's the state hospital site?
Yeah, State Hospital site.
Is that main building with the dome, was that there in the Civil War?
That was there. Part of it was there. I'm not sure all of it, but part of it was. The Mills building, the oldest building there, that was definitely there. Wow. And anyway, they felt the brick wall around the site to make it more secure, but these 200, including Myers, stayed in Columbia. And when they evacuated the prison about a week before Sherman came. And
so that wall is still standing?
That's still there. Amelia helped many of them escape. She probably also helped a number of spies that were in Columbia as well, too. That's actually some prisoners from Sorghum, by the way. Then February 17, 1865, this guy comes to Columbia. And story goes that Amelia made herself known to Sherman, told him what she had done. Sherman reportedly said she was the most loyal person she ever found in the Confederacy, he ever saw in the Confederacy. And she probably told him things not to burn.
Now we're still on the facts, not the...
Yeah, we're still on the facts.
Not the myths.
Yeah. And then, of course, a fire that night burning Columbia. The feature store would have been right here. That's the old City County Courthouse. That was City Hall. The State House is there in the background. The glow of that fire, by the way, was so bright that people could see it all the way up Rock Hill. And I would say you could read a newspaper by it.
Wow.
Yeah.
Well, now you just said that she told him what to burn and what not to burn.
Yeah, the soldiers were drunk. So they weren't listening. They were out of control.
That's what we had heard.
Yeah. And that basically, that's Main Street the next day, and where that arrow points to where their house would have been. This, by the way, area was called Wool Dublin. It was an Irish business district. And that nickname, Wool Dublin, lasted until early into the 20th century. And you had oyster saloons, seamstresses, had people. Columbia had a very large Celtic population. 18% of all heads of household in Richmond County were either born in Scotland or Ireland, according to the U.S. Census records. Yeah.
And that, what street would that be?
That's Main Street. You're looking from
The arrow's pointing somewhere.
that'd be the corner of Sumter and Main Street where the garage is now. Sumter and Washington where the garage is.
Okay.
Yeah.
And that's where Feaster lived?
Right. Okay, Amelia Edmond, one of her and Jacob's daughters, and Marie. Apparently, she started calling herself Marie around 1860. They accompanied Sherman's army into North Carolina. They went from Columbia to Fayetteville, where they took a ferry up to Philadelphia, where presumably Amelia went to see family members. And apparently, the family visit didn't go well because by December 1865, they were seen in New York City at the Astor House Hotel, which Abraham Lincoln stayed at on his way to Washington for his first inauguration. And then Marie had a picture taken by Matthew Brady in New York. Colonel James Gibbs, who was acting mayor, who became mayor of Columbia after the burning, visited New York on business, and Amelia found out he was in town, asked him to come and sign a statement that Jacob Feaster was dead. According to him, she was in a luxury suite surrounded by a bunch of Union Sold officers and had papers that, "Can you sign this?" And he said, "No, I can't." She said, "Why?" "I saw him 3 days ago." And the paper was so she could get $10,000. Next year, U.S. Senator John Sherman introduced a bill in the Senate to compensate Amelia $10,000 for her contributions to the war effort. Yes, he is the brother of General Sherman. And it's kind of an interesting contrast. You know, Sherman goes known for fire. John was known as the Ohio Icicle. Fire and ice. Sherman hated politics, never wanted to run for office, was often mentioned as a potential presidential candidate, probably could have been elected, never did. John, on the other hand, wanted to be president and ran for president several times and failed to get the party nomination, though he eventually became the Secretary of State.
So $10,000 was a lot of money back
Yeah,
then.
actually, at one time she wanted $100,000. There's a letter from an officer who signed the affidavit. There was an affidavit signed by Sherman and some other people, you know, speaking to her qualities, if you will. And then someone claimed that she said that she needed $100,000 for it to cover her expenses. And he wrote her a scalding letter back saying, "That is a rip-off. You don't owe that much money. If you don't retract that, I will expose you, blah, blah, blah." Anyway, the bill passed the Senate unanimously, but was tabled in the U.S. House. Why it was tabled, I can't tell you. You know, in Robert's rule, motions to table are not debatable. I can tell you, however, several other similar bills were tabled that very same day. So it just might have been a reflection of the mood of the House, or they were just saying, we're tired of all these freeloaders.
So she didn't get the $10,000.
No, she didn't. She died broke in New York in 1870 from anemia and was buried in a pauper's grave in Philadelphia. Yeah. And her dead husband outlived her by 25 years. Now, he and his other, and the daughters, family members that stayed with him, moved to Florida. And so as the 1950s, there were still family members down there. And in the winter of 1865-66, we don't know, she married John S. Beecher. Beecher was a successful New York importer, probably 20 years older than Marie. I have pored over census records. I cannot find the guy. I found enough to know that he existed, but that's about it. Some say he imported tea, others say he imported oil. They had one child, William Preston Beecher, named after her Civil War era sweetheart, born in 1867. They were divorced the next year because Beecher had an affair. Beecher, by the way, kept custody of William, but he and his mother still had a good relationship. Marie went to Europe, passed herself out of Marie Barbuzet of New Orleans. That is probably the most flattering picture of her, my personal favorite. She returned to the U.S. in the May 1870s and moved to Baltimore, where she met Arthur de Portales Georgier, a French diplomat. He came from a very prominent family that had members in both France and Germany. And in fact, they were married in Baltimore by the Archbishop of Baltimore. Significant because Baltimore is the oldest Catholic diocese in America. And so being the Archbishop is kind of sort of a symbolic leader of the church here in the U.S.
Well, when she made that trip to France and back, would that have been on a sailing ship?
Probably. We don't know. I don't know what ship she took. I know she took her sister Edmond with her, and Edmond was educated in some convents there. The Count was a widower with one daughter, Jenny, who Marie lived as her own. Like I said, they got married in Baltimore, and his postings took him to Japan, Guatemala, and Italy. One thing I was to tell you about that picture is when I was doing the book, I wrote the French Foreign Ministry asking them, hey, do you by chance have a record or archives of this guy? And I got a response saying, thank you for your email. We will forward to the appropriate authorities, and we'll get back to you as soon as possible. I'm still waiting for them to get back to me.
But he did exist, and you're pretty sure.
Yeah, the Count definitely, there's more about the Count than there is Beecher.
Okay.
A lot more. It took the Dutch West Indies life until Krakatoa. The largest volcanic eruption in recorded history took place. And by the way, Krakatoa is west of Java, not east of Java like the movie title says. And the really scary thing is, it's reforming, and volcanologists say that if it blows its top again, it'll be even worse. To give you an idea how bad it was, the world's temperature was lowered by 3 degrees. There was so much ash and soot in the atmosphere. And it also affected the way the colors at night went. Anyway, one of the few things we have written about her in our own hand was her talking about the explosion. She said, the tales of the disaster was much exaggerated, but it was bad, horrible enough, but we escaped everything. The reason it was because there was a mountain that separated them from the side where the volcano erupted. So they were shielded, if you will. And of course, they talk about the noise, the cloud, and so on, rain. And then here's the piece to resistance of her comments. Thousands of people were destroyed, but they were Chinese and Malays only. About 10 Europeans, fortunately. That's kind of rather cold, if you ask me. But talk about the seaport swept over the town with tremendous force carrying all with into the main ocean. Afterwards, her husband was assigned to Switzerland. They eventually settled in Italy, where she died in 1908 after years of suffering from ill health and depression. According to one person who saw her shortly before she died, she was still very attractive. Her hair had turned to silver. Her eyes, by the way, were blue. She was buried in an undisclosed location in Italy. I think they did that to prevent gawkers, like myself, from trying to find her grave. Jenny died in 1898 at the age of 41, and that was in a way a blessing in disguise, because Jenny married a German military officer. And with World War I, she would have been in a real jam because she was married to a German, and yet she was of French and American parents. So her loyalties would have been tested. The Count died in 1928. President Beecher, and this is the best image I could ever find of him, enjoyed a successful career as a diplomat, journalist, and historian. He died in 1939. He was married, but I don't think he could not find any children. Now, part 2. Well, in a minute. When the legend becomes fact, print the legend. One of my favorite quotes. Or, as we would call it today, fake news. In 1878, the first biography, quotations mark, was written about her. A checkered life, a brief history of Countess Bertels. Miss Marie Boozer, written by one who knows. One who knows was journalist, author Julian Selby. Selby was actually a good writer. He wrote a book about the turn of the last century, about Columbia's history that I've cited many times over the years. This book was payback. Reportedly, Marie and still Amelia and him were having an affair. Marie found out about it and was loyal to Jacob and made them break it up. According to this book, now the first part of the book is fairly okay as far as up to the Civil War years, but then he claimed that Marie was kidnapped by the son of Brigham Young, and then took the entire U.S. cavalry to get her back. She was involved in the scandal involving the theft of the crown jewels of the Tsar of Russia. And he also linked her with Cora Pearl, a notorious European courtesan. Cora Pearl was a Lady Gaga Madonna of her day. There was one time she showed up for an event where her coach, her dress, and dog had all been dyed the exact same color. There was a gala she gave one time where a big platter was brought out with one of those little dome covers on top. They lifted it up and it was her naked as a jaybird. So she led a very colorful life. And some say she was inspiration for Sherlock Holmes' nemesis, Irene Adler. Checkered Life was republished in 1915 with additional material as the Countess Brutalis. The author, credited as Felix Oldboy, was Jake Snowden. If you ever went to Carolina, you might remember Old Snowden Dormitory in the Honeycombs. Head of University of South Carolina's History Department, a very highly respected historian. Now, why would a highly respected college historian write a book about Marie Boozer? For money. He also added a new preface and other new information. Snowden was actually embarrassed by what he did. And there's a letter I read about him in which he said, she doesn't think I would write that kind of material, does she? Referring to a mutual friend that the person he was corresponding to. Then we had Colonel David, and I put Colonel in quotations mark because he was never a colonel. He was actually a captain in the Confederate Army, but he gave himself a promotion after the war. And he wrote numerous scandalous pieces about Marie. His motivation, she jilted him. And then in 1905, we had the first edition of Mary Chestnut's Diary from Dixie. Incidentally, Mary Chestnut would have been very upset with that title. She hated the term Dixie and hated the song Dixie. Jefferson Davis also hated Dixie. On the other hand, Abraham Lincoln considered it one of his favorite songs. No reference to Amelia Marie in this edition, probably too scandalous for the time. Then the 1949 re-edited version referred to them only as Boozer and Mrs. F. And then the 1981 edition, Mary Chestnut Civil War, which is the one I was consult, used her full names and had a lot to say about her. One person said, quotes one person, did the entire Union Army go off at Marie? Next several decades, various legends and myths have been presented in fact in various books about Sherman, South Carolina. Among them, the WPA Guide to South Carolina. Another thing you also found in doing my research is I found references to her in newspaper articles all the way up to Washington State, literally all across the country, a true tabloid queen, if you will. And many of the stories, it's kind of the same plot. She goes to fill in the blank, has an affair with fill in the blank, and is beheaded. The fill in the blanks include a Thailand warlord, a Japanese warlord, a Chinese warlord, and a Zulu prince. The Zulu prince has an extra element. He shrunk her head and wore it around his neck. Many accounts wrongly link Marie with Major General Justin Kilpatrick, Sherman's chief of cavalry and one of the worst or best womanizers in the entire Union Army. One of my favorite stories is, if you're a Civil War buff, you may have heard of Dahlgren's Raid, on which they tried to free prisoners from a prison in Richmond, which was another fiasco. Well, prior to the raid, Kilpatrick made posted about the fact that he had taken Custer's mistress away from him. Well, the raid was a disaster for the Union Army, and Kilpatrick came back and found out the mistress had left in a Dear John letter saying, I'm going back to Custer, he's a better lover, So Kilpatrick had to win an arrest as a spy. After the war, he became a U.S. ambassador to Chile. And on the way to Chile, he met this young married couple, and one of whom was a military officer. And he got off the boat in Panama and asked if he would look after his wife. He said, sure. So from Panama to Chile, they passed themselves off as husband and wife. And then when they get to Chile, the woman embarks on a new career as a high-priced call girl, servicing Europeans, which almost cost Kilpatrick his job as ambassador. Kilpatrick is the great-grandfather of CNN's Anderson Cooper, by the way. And if you look at the eyes and the nose, I mean, the strong resemblance there. Of course. Okay, the first novel I'm reading came out in 1958 by Nellis Grayson, Another Jezebel. Grayson wrote Tales of Columbia, which some of you may remember was very popular back in the 60s and 70s. Just about every library around town had copies of it. In fact, you can still find some today. It's probably one of the best books ever written about the history of Columbia. I've referenced several times myself. Grayson intended to write a nonfiction account of Marie, but could not find enough stuff, so she turned it into a novel, and really hated it. Only one edition was ever printed because she felt that was a bad book, and bad books did not deserve, further editions, and really rued the day that she wrote it. Though in 1964 she wrote about Marie and had some true facts to probably clear her conscience. Elizabeth Boatwright Coker is probably the most successful female author in South Carolina history, unless you count Mary Chestnut. She's a granddaughter of the founder of Coker College. She moved to New York, and while there, she met Robert Frost, who encouraged her to become a writer. And she did. She wrote 8 or 9 different novels in the 20th century. Coker had planned on writing a factual biography about Marie originally, but it fell through. In 1974, she tried again with working title Sandoval Scandal, but never got to the treatment stage. In 1976, she wrote a factual article for Sandpiper magazine that recorded some of the things she wrote in her best-selling book, La Belle. 1959 edition, a critical and commercial success. 1960, a paperback version came out with Saying That Is Not in the Book on the cover. But still kind of, probably they didn't care, they just said, this will sell books. It was reprinted again in 1976, which is what I call the Farrah Fawcett edition. Yeah. And then this is what I call the Precious Moments edition. And this one is probably the most accurate cover of them all. Now, unbeknownst to Grayson and Coker, Elizabeth Battle, a niece of Marie, was living in Florida, read the books, and was absolutely horrified. Neil Grayson wrote a letter of apologies, and family members were still around, blah, blah, blah. On the other hand, the correspondence between Coker and Grayson and Coker and Battle literally was about, you can actually hear the claws coming out when you read this note. The Feaster family descendants were not all happy with the way they were treated and everything. They talked about suing Coker and everything else, and Grayson told Coker that if I know you were doing this, I'll give you all my material and let you have it. Eventually, things were kind of calmed down, settled down, and peace was made. But yeah, she gave a big headache for Coker and for her editor. Anyway, you still find some false stuff. There was a biography of Kilpatrick that came out in the 90s. That's still handling with Marie. Hopefully now this will all come to an end. And the truth is, she was not quite the floozy that everyone made her out to be. She did not lose her head, literally. And she had lived a very exciting life in and of itself. So, anyway, I've said the book, Scanlon's Life of the Carolina Bells. I have this. This is $20. The big book.
You're all back here.
Okay.
I'll hold it up for you.
Okay. The big book, Carnival Destruction, which tells you anything, everything you ever wanted to know about Sherman's March of South Carolina but was afraid to ask, is $40. That's the one that sort of started it all. Columbia Civil War Landmark is self-explanatory. There's 60 sites in the Greater Columbia area related to the war that you can see in there, and the Case Museum, by the way, is in it. And then the other one is Pirates Raid, which is the first actual narrative account of the last Civil War campaign in South Carolina. It went from Georgetown to Sumter to Camden, basically to destroy some Confederate railroads. It's significant because the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, who, of course, if you've seen the movie Glory, you're familiar with them, was involved in that raid. Also, the last Union officer killed in action in the war was on that raid. And much of it happened after Lee surrendered. So, and that's $20. Skinny books are $20, the fat book is $40. Or we also run a special where you can buy all four for $90, we take 10% off. Does anybody have any questions?
I've got one.
Yes, ma'am.
I brought my book with me and I want you to sign it.
I'll be happy to.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, autographs are free. Yes, ma'am.
Tom, you termed it Kardashians of South Carolina for the 19th century or whatever, and we know the Kardashians of the 21st century, it's TV
Right.
that has kind of kept them in the limelight and spotlight. So mass-produced novels, magazine articles.
You find, well, actually in the 19th century, there was a lot of newspaper articles about her. I said all over the country, then little booklets and pamphlets. I mean, if the National Enquirer had been around back then, she would have been a regular in it. I mean, she was that, and people tend to think, that tabloid gossip is something new. It wasn't. I mean, there was a magazine called the Police Gazette that had all kinds of skin-laid stories. I remember I looked at a special edition, reprint edition of one in which they talk about how the second cousin of Abraham Lincoln ran a traveling bordello. I'm going, ooh. So, I mean, so you had that kind of stuff was out there in then.
Well, yellow journalism was huge in New York City. They had like 60 newspapers at one time, and half of them were like the National Enquirer.
Right.
And they would take the slightest thing, like Marie Boozer or anything else, and run it for weeks on end. As long as it would sell a paper, they would fictionalize or write something more.
And a lot of these stories were picked up. Like there's one story about Marie in which the same story, the same typesetting, the same illustration was used in about a half dozen different papers in 6 different states at the time. So it's really about her guy around.
Yeah, there was, so she was the Kim Kardashian of the era.
Right. And her mother was basically the Christian because she really did promote her daughter. She was, Amelia was a social climber by any definition. She wanted to make sure her daughter was among the tops of society, be it New York or Europe. And Marie basically got fed up with her mom and abandoned her.
Well, one of her socialite friends in New York became Winston Churchill's mother, I believe.
That was one of Kilpatrick's daughters did that. She's the one, no, actually one of Kilpatrick's granddaughters introduced Wallace to Edward VII. So, proving that the fruit doesn't always fall far from the tree. And of course, Ashley Cooper's mom is Gloria Vanderbilt, the famous designer, and she was subject to one of the most sensational child custody trials of the 20th century. So, yeah, it's really kind of crazy how some of these